Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Forum. Today we'll be discussing the urbanization of conflict, and I'm very happy to have with us Ms. Ayesha Malik, our very own editor at the DLP Forum. Ayesha, I wanted to begin by asking you about, the phenomenon of urbanization. We have seen, that there's evidence to suggest that, there is a greater shift towards urban conflict taking place, whereas urban areas were, at least somewhat removed from the critical mass of conflict taking place around the world. But we're seeing that change. So, Ayesha, does greater urbanization help create the conditions for conflict, or do we see, a genuine shift in conflict now taking place in urban areas, just as part of new conflict dynamics?
Yeah, it's a bit interesting when we look at this as a phenomenon of urbanization of conflict, and it's kind of been touted as this new thing in contemporary warfare, that war is now in cities. And when you look at it historically, war has always been waged on cities. Like even in World War II, apart from Hiroshima, the worst actual conventional bombing was actually in Tokyo, Dresden. The battle for Stalingrad was probably the worst battle in a city ever seen.
Absolutely.
So war has always been waged where people live, and that means that it's been waged in urban areas. And what we saw was a decline in that in the Cold War era. So in Vietnam, Cambodia, we saw guerrilla fighters move to jungles, forests, and now we're seeing that return because urbanization has grown so much. And so now, they're saying that cities are the jungles of the 1970s and the 1980s. And urbanization really from 2008, that was like the tipping point when you had a majority of people now living in cities. Currently, the number is 55% of the world.
Okay, wow.
And in 2030, that's going to go up to 60%. So 1 in 3 people are going to be living in cities.
Wow.
And the ICRC has said that about 50 million people are affected currently by armed conflict in cities. So we're seeing both. We're seeing a return to cities as a place of urban conflict, and we're also seeing a huge rural to urban migration. And as people are moving from rural to urban areas, we're seeing that the insurgencies, the guerrilla fighters are kind of depending on them for information, intelligence, hideouts, for food, for sustenance. They're also moving with them to cities.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, and especially when they're able to mobilize people on an ideological level, either through identity, through ethnicity, religion, in rural areas, they moved with them to urban areas, and you see those ethnic cleavages also in cities. And that's kind of all becomes like the fodder for growing insurgency, revolutions. Like the epicenters for revolutions have always been cities. Even when we're looking at Afghanistan, the key important date was when the Taliban took Kabul.
Yeah,
right? Why was
absolutely.
that such an important thing? It was an important feat because cities are the concentrations of state power. And so it's incredibly important who holds them and who doesn't.
Absolutely. And I think, apart from cities being symbolic, manifestations of power, and this is how guerrilla movements can demonstrate that they have power. I think also all the other elements that you've mentioned, specifically, how cities are now these fund generating places. So there's a lot of resources. I think one really good example is Karachi.
Yeah.
Right. So we've seen that, the terrorism or the militancy that we saw in Pakistan, whether it was in the erstwhile Fatah region or in Balochistan, Karachi was used traditionally, a few decades ago as a place for R&R. Right. They would rest and relax, go to Karachi to do that, and then they'd go back to the fronts. Right. And then what we saw was Karachi becoming, whether it was because of the kinetic operations taking place in those areas, the people started shifting to Karachi and using it as a place for conducting their activities.
Yeah.
So whether it was terrorism, whether it was bombings, we saw not only that taking place, but also, using Karachi as a base to raise funds.
Yeah.
So things like kidnapping for ransom, we saw that go up. Extortion money, bhatta, which they call in Pakistan, that skyrocketed. We had targeted killings, assassinations, bank robberies, and of course your regular phone and two-wheeler snatching and all of that taking place, right?
Yeah, I think which every resident has some story about.
Exactly, especially in Karachi, and so Karachi's dynamics become really interesting when you look at the history of Karachi. So we did a study, a few years back, looking at that. It's not really Karachi is the 5th or 6th largest city in the world, population-wise. but it's not really the size of the population that matters. It's the rapidity of growth.
Yes.
Like how quickly does this city grow,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Karachi in 1947, when Pakistan gained independence, was just about 450,000 people. And now it is 22 million plus, right?
It's absolutely phenomenal. And when you look at it in terms of even a much closer history, 1998 to 2011, 115% growth of the city. You added 11 million inhabitants to a city over the course of, we're talking about 13 years.
Wow.
That's crazy growth. That's like burgeoning. Yeah. That's like a metropolis that has just like come up.
Absolutely. And then when you see issues of, you've already had, issues of ineffectual government, the inability to establish the British state. And then when you add, just these numbers to it, it just exacerbates the entire situation. And that is what then I think provides that fertile ground for recruitment or for further crime to take place or organized crime to take place. And then, really having the city being taken over by these entities and allowing for that type of violence to take place.
Yeah, there are an estimated 200 criminal gangs in Karachi.
Wow.
And also you have these ideological extremist groups as well. And they're all competing over votes, power, land, and, providing then money for extortion and for protection. So yeah, it's kind of just this breeding ground for an insurgency, for violence. And the question where IHL comes in is, when does it reach that threshold as well? Because that's very blurred then when you have a sprawling metropolis and sprawling slums where you have so much violence. When does that move beyond like an internal disturbance to something that actually would attract IHL?
Absolutely. And you've had pitched battles in Karachi. I wouldn't say that it's reached the stage of, say, an armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict, but you've certainly seen conflict dynamics in Karachi. Like it is something of concern. Yeah. Something that needs to be, mechanisms need to be developed there to de-escalate in that sense. But what we've also seen more recently, especially in Karachi, is the law enforcement, attitude that now, enough is enough. Yeah. We need to bring back the city from the brink. And so the Rangers operation that took place, about 5-6 years ago, that had a massive impact on and has significantly reduced a lot of the violence that used to take place there. But at the same time, we've seen violence come up in other places or types of violence increase in other places in Karachi. So you have a lot more vehicle snatching. That's taking place. So street crimes have gone up and a number of those things. But it's really interesting seeing how all of this plays out in Karachi, especially with the connection to Balochistan, with the connection to the Pashtun connection and all of that. So and seeing how this is a melting pot of so many different cultures of Pakistan. It's really magnificent to see how that plays into the conflict dynamics there.
Yeah, and it's a bit of what they call an onion conflict. Like there are many layers to the conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's linguistic, it's also ethnic, it's also tribal, it's also religious. There are so many facets to it. And how then does a state try and consolidate its power in an area like that?
Absolutely. So Ayesha, some of the most flagrant examples of urban violence is, we've seen in Syria. Yeah. We've seen, cities being bombed, barrel bombing by the Assad regime, and so much taking place over there. How are we seeing conflict change once it gets into an urban environment? And then the question of civilian protections comes about. How do we protect civilians in this, new battlefield that emerges, out of, say, more traditional battlefields, rural battlefields?
It's very interesting to see how much civilian suffering there is in cities. You're right to mention Syria. Aleppo, Mosul, Raqqa, Sana'a, all of these cities we've seen go through, incredible indiscriminate bombing. When you look at Aleppo, I think Amnesty International did a study and they found that 83 barrel bombs were dropped in 1 month in a city of that size with that, that densely populated. And the issue is that you have these urban terrains which are incredibly densely populated. So how do you use weapons there? How do you ensure that civilians are protected? There are accounts in Mosul when they were having the 9-month fight for the city that you were having insurgents fight each other one was in the sitting room, one was in the lounge,
Wow.
one was in the kitchen, and then there were civilians just going about their daily life on the floor above.
So it was literally,
Tongue to cheek, kind of
Yeah.
like fighting with
Door-to-door
civilians there.
combat,
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And so you have the issue of how do you distinguish between a civilian and a combatant when there's so much intermingling and it's so difficult to figure out who's a fighter, who's a civilian DPIH, how do you target in that kind of a climate. Also, you have the issue of the interconnectedness of services. So in rural areas, if someone takes out, your water supply, there will be a village water well or something that you can use. In cities, everyone is entirely reliant on services. So if you're taking out electricity, it has such a reverberating and knock-on effect on other services, and it can mean the difference between life and death for civilians, even if that could have been operating as a dual-use object at the time.
And also, I mean, if you take out, say, a water pump in a rural setting, the number of people affected are far fewer than they would be if you did it in an urban setting, right? It's just the concentration of numbers there plays such a big difference, makes such a big difference there.
Yeah, and I remember reading something about the UN delegation to Iraq, and they were going in 1991, so it was the first Gulf War, and they were saying that, and I wrote this quote down because I just thought it really hit me at the time when I read it. Iraq has for some time to come been relegated to a pre-industrial age, but with all the disabilities of post-industrial dependency on an intensive use of energy and technology.
Wow.
And so you have bombed them back to the cave age time, to the Stone Age. And at the same time, they can't, continue because they have this post-industrial dependence on everything. And I think for me, that's the key thing about interconnectedness of services. Because if you have electricity, if you don't have electricity, you can't purify your water. You can't preserve your food. You can't pump away your sewage. You can't clean the streets. You can't irrigate your crops. So everything is so interconnected. Your life supporting needs are so, contingent on power supply, water supply, electricity supply. So when you take them out of a city, when you destroy that in a city, what does that mean for civilian life? And it almost means that it's,
it cripples it.
Exactly. It becomes uninhabitable for civilians.
Wow.
And similarly, you then have the blast radius of weapons. So explosive weapons, even if you have a blast radius of a few hundred meters in a city, that means that, you could be wiping out God knows what. And so civilians have been adapting to this in terms of, I remember reading in Syria, they started to move their schools underground. In Ukraine, also, they were holding very irregular classes. So they were holding classes in the evening for students because they were just it's less likely to get bombed at that time. They were moving hospitals underground. So in those ways, civilians are adapting to urban conflict. And similarly, the military is adapting to urban conflict because they found that there are so many signals going off in urban centers that it blocks their reconnaissance, their surveillance methods. And so in Iraq, actually, the US military abandoned it altogether and they started using humans again. They were just we need human information, so sending people in instead of, sending in their whatever technology that they use. And they're also adapting with the weaponry because you can't just drop a bomb now in an urban center. So the US, especially for Afghanistan and Pakistan, it came up with the Romeo Hellfire 2 missile.
Okay.
It's very interesting because usually if you're dropping it on a building, a drone, it won't destroy the building, but it will just detonate on impact. So you don't know who you're getting. You don't know, even though you have so much more information about which floor they're on. So the Hellfire 2 missile, the interesting thing about that is that it will penetrate the building maybe 2 floors down and then it will detonate. So it has a delayed fuse so that it can detonate later. And a lot of people argue that urban conflict, IHL itself, does, make the military rely more on drones, and the proliferation of drones is largely due to IHL because you need precision targeting, you need all of that stuff.
And another question I would have here is that, with the urbanization of conflict, and you mentioned this very rightly, that, accuracy becomes a far more important, right? Because you're in such compact areas and so densely populated areas. Is it that, IHL can only be complied with by richer, bigger forces? who have the specialized weaponry, or in situations of asymmetric warfare, where you have guerrilla groups or militants or ISIS, for example, that we saw, they won't have the sophisticated weapons that we're talking about here. Can they abide by IHL? Can IHL operate within an urban setting like that?
Yeah, it becomes incredibly difficult, especially when you look at in many ways, superior military forces will still have the upper ground, even though they're the weapons that they're allowed to use, everything in their military arsenal, they won't be allowed to use in an urban terrain. But at the same time, the way that non-state armed groups who are especially weaker than these military forces, they will attempt to have these conflicts more in urban terrain, because what favors them is a protracted and long conflict.
Absolutely, and of course the human shields.
Yes, exactly. So also they will use their knowledge of this, especially these sprawling slums that the militaries, especially foreign militaries, won't be aware of. They'll use their knowledge of like these alleyways and all of that kind of stuff to have some kind of high ground. But equally, there is a huge issue, especially we saw this with the Hamas, about the use of human shields and the fact that the population becomes a third-party player to the conflict. Because they're both sides are trying to win the heart and minds of the people, and so they're kind of either being protected or hurt on purpose by either side. And so there were accounts in Yemen that they would drop pamphlets to abide by the precautionary principle and say, "Get out of this area, we're going to bomb it." If you even picked up one of those, you could be killed by an ISIS sniper fire. Wow. I think this is in Syria. So you're just like, okay, the civilian population kind of feels it from both sides. And similarly, with the human shields argument, Israel has said that if we're going to drop pamphlets and then humans are still not going to get out of the way, what that means is that they are combatants and they're targetable. And if that's not supported by international law, that's a huge stretch. Yeah, that's not supported by international law at all. But that does come into this play of asymmetric warfare in urban conflicts, especially because states are like, how can we ensure that civilian life is protected? It's very hard to abide by a distinction or proportionality or precautionary principle. And so to do that, they're kind of looking for loopholes, and the human shields caveat is one of them. They're saying we shouldn't include them in the proportionality calculation. We shouldn't include them. They should be targetable if we've given them every opportunity to leave.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gaza is an open air prison. So how much you can argue that, the civilians are there by choice is, again, a huge stretch.
And I think, your discussion really goes to the fact that, there are limitations on the law. There's only so much that the law can limit or restrict the parties to a conflict. And in the end, you are going to see atrocities taking place on both sides, especially when the battlefield is an urban battlefield.
Yeah.
So I just think it just exacerbates all the bad things, all the negative elements on that front. Actually, I just wanted to end on where you see conflict trends developing. Do you feel that there's going to be a continued shift in conflict moving to urban centers, or do you think that this is just something temporary that we're seeing now because of the particular dynamics of this time that we're in?
And so there's kind of a utopian versus a dystopian view of this. So the utopian people argue that, as people move to cities, urbanization is actually a very good thing because it reduces conflict, because you have more and more opportunities for people, their needs are more met. It's easier to meet their needs also because, you have consolidated control. And so it leads to economic growth. I mean, most of the GDP in the world is generated in cities. But secondly, a lot of people argue that there's poor governance, inadequate resources, you're going to get more insurgency. And they argue that it's going to lead to these feral cities where nobody has any control. It's complete lawlessness. And
Gotham.
In many areas. And I think that the more we're seeing conflict spread to urban areas, and I think the more there are very lucrative targets, the possibility for media attention, international exposure, which is what non-state groups really want. I think you're going to get more and more conflict in cities. And so I think I'm kind of more on the side of the dystopian view of the future. And I think that that's why it's going to be even more important to ensure that civilians are protected at a time like that.
And I know I said this was the last question, but just one thing. Do you think that we can develop IHL to look at this new reality? Do you think there's scope for for at least countries to come together and look at some solutions to this, because we do see that this is concentrated in certain areas. We don't see the developing world, the developed world suffering from the types of things that we're seeing in Syria or in Yemen or in other places. Do you think that that there is enough appetite to develop specific rules perhaps for urban conflict?
I think so, because I think the reaction to urban conflict is so much more visceral than I think it happening in a rural area where you don't really relate to the lives of people who live in the countryside and you don't really understand what's going on. Whereas anything that happens in a city, you have so much international media attention. Like, we do know a lot about what's happening in Aleppo. We know a lot about what's happening in Mosul. And so for that reason, I feel like there should be an appetite for the international community to come together and be like, how do we more adequately protect civilians? And I worry that will just be focused on building weaponry, which is more precise, rather than, on ensuring that we have a better protection in terms of, defining between what's a civilian DPIH and what isn't, and defining what would be a disproportionate attack.
Thank you, Ayesha. That was really helpful. Thank you.